Hello, everyone. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual extension of the City Lights events calendar. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone peoples, aka the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Tonight, we are delighted to be celebrating the publication of The American Daughters by Maurice Carlos Ruffin, published by One World. It is always a pleasure to be able to host Maurice, and we've been great fans of his work here at City Lights for many years. And One World Books is also a publisher that we hold in great esteem, so wonderful combination here. The American Daughters is Maurice's third novel. It's an emotionally and intellectually engaging work that grapples with the legacies of American slavery. His imagination and wit are at full steam in this latest work. So we're really happy to have him back in our orbit once again for this really amazing book. Maurice Carlos Ruffin is the author of The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You and We Cast a Shadow. He is recipient of an Iowa Review Award in fiction and has had his writing published in the Virginia Quarterly Review, in Agni, and Kenyon Review, also in The Unfathomable City, a New Orleans atlas, a really amazing book amongst other places. So he is a native of New Orleans. He's also a professor of creative writing at Louisiana State University. Joining him tonight in conversation will be Jamila Minnicks. Her novel, Moonrise over New Jessup, published by Algonquin Books, won the Penn Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction and was a finalist for the 2023 Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. Her short stories and essays have appeared in Plowshares, The Sun, Craft, Catapult, amongst other outlets. Jamila's work has been supported by the Sewanee Writers Conference and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. If you haven't read Moonrise over New Jessup, pick up a copy together with The American Daughters. It's really magnificent. So join us now in giving a warm welcome to Maurice Carlos Ruffin and Jamila Minnicks. Welcome to you both. Welcome to City Lights.
Hey, everybody.
Okay, am I muted? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. And I see some friends out
Wonderful.
there. Wow, I see some
Great.
old friends. I see Hemi out there in the audience and some other people too. What's up, folks?
Bobby, good evening, good evening. How are you feeling this evening, Mr. Man of the Hour?
I feel much better now that we're going to do this event. You know, this is one of the great bookstores in America. Every time I do something with City Lights, good things happens. And I know that this is going to be on YouTube, so people are going to be seeing this like forever, which is really exciting too.
Yes. So I'm honored to be here. Like I said, like I was telling you before, there are about 1.5 million authors I can think of who are probably better qualified than me, but I'm going to do my best to honor your work and honor you. And let's just get into it. So for y'all who don't know, Maurice and I have been friends for what is it now? 2 years, couple years
That's right.
now.
Yeah.
So when he was writing The American Daughters, we had this conversation about the title. And so I'm going to start because I want to ask you a question about the title. You ready?
A question about the title.
A question about the title.
All right.
All right. So why did you name it The American Daughters and not The American Sons?
Oh.
Oh.
Well, I mean, you know, look, that's a great question. You know, the cast of characters here, I mean, it's probably like 90% women and girls. There's only a couple of guys in the book. And I think one of my goals in writing this after I got started was I'm telling untold stories by unsung heroes. And as I developed the book, I was getting more and more excited. I said, you know what? I want to make sure that these ladies get as much screen time as possible. So by the time I finished the draft and you saw it, it was a foregone conclusion that it'd be daughters and not sons.
But why is that? Like, why did you ever think about doing it from like the men's perspective? Why did you go from one? Why did you choose the women? I guess is my question.
You can blame Mama Toni Morrison. Um,
Uh-huh.
you know, in her foreword to Song of Solomon, she
Hmm.
was talking about how she wanted to take a different tactic from her early work, like Bluest Eye and Sula. And Sula's like, you know, one of my favorite books of all time. And she was
Hmm.
saying that she felt a little constrained by how there was an expectation because of the lady lead cast that people expected like these sort of domestic stories. And so she goes and does Song of Solomon, and we have Milkman at the center of that entire text, and he's kind of going out on adventures. And so I'm like, okay, that's interesting. I'm gonna try the exact opposite of that. I want to have these ladies be at the center of the text, and I want to see what kind of story I could create. Because I feel like with the guys, I don't know, like they'd be like more gunplay, more like running around with like swords, that kind of stuff. And I wasn't interested in that at all. I want to see like, community and conversations and mischief and spying and these sort of behind the scene things, and just like as a sort of task for myself, could I pull it off? And so that's really why I did it. Yeah.
Were there any women that sort of inspired the women in your story?
Oh yeah, I didn't figure this out until the book tour started. I think you may have heard me say this. Just that I was my mother and my grandmother and my aunties in different ways were involved in activism throughout their lives, different ways. And I kept thinking about what would it be like if they were alive during this era, the pre-Civil War era. And I thought, yeah, my grandma and my mom, and my aunties and my cousins, like the Avengers in the 1860s. And when I sort of figured that out, it just went off to the races.
Did you use like family names, or where they? Because a lot of the people in the book have multiple names. So first, did you use family names, and then can you sort of talk to us about how you chose to use multiple names for like the same person?
I'm trying to think. So let's see, we have Audie, Sanite, Lenore, Alabama, Tremaine. There's almost no family names except for Tremaine is a cousin of mine, but that cousin is actually male.
Okay.
So there's that, but I think
Jermaine can go both ways though. That's
what
it
exactly.
should still be an honor to him.
Yeah, exactly. But I think for me, I'm always trying to find a name, like naming a baby. Like what name fits that baby the best? What name fits the personality, their sort of point of view, the way that they're going to move through the story? And so I got all original names. And then the idea of them having multiple names is a lot like what I see in the community. I mean, the people in my family who I have so much love and respect for, and then I see them in sort of mixed company. And, maybe like my auntie, they worked in the cafeteria, or like my cousin, they like drove a bus or something like that. And people don't have the same level of respect for them. And so I thought about the idea of how Black women in particular have these sort of multiple identities depending on the situation that they're in amongst family versus being out in the world. And one of the things that happens in the book is that the slave owner, Dumarche or Dumarche, however he says his name, I don't really necessarily care about that, but he gives Audie a name that's not the name her mother gave her. And of course, her mother immediately says, "You ain't gonna listen to that guy. I gave you a name, never forget that, and that's gonna protect you throughout time." And then on top of that, there's the sort of like idea of who you are when you're young, and as you sort of grow and change, you may like bestow your own name or have a nickname bestowed upon you. So, Audie and Lenore and the others have multiple names, and also as spies, it's useful to have multiple names too.
But then, I mean, that's interesting because I want to stay there for a second. When you talk about as spies, they had multiple names. Now, the idea of the actual women as spies, and you said you weren't sort of interested in the men because you felt like there would be like gunplay and things like that. But do you feel like the women um, would be more subversive? Did you find women in history who had sort of engaged in these subversive activities?
I mean, at the risk of sounding facetious, every woman throughout history, I feel like guys are often kind of not very smart when they deal with like conflict and trying to improve their own lives. It's often this sort of frontal assault and a sort of demand for what they want. Where, I mean, look, Harriet Tubman, this is a lady who literally is like, you know, she got free and then she came back down and went to the plantations and made it a point to go into these dangerous areas and say, how can I help y'all get free? And some say that she probably went in like in disguise, like saying, "Oh, I'm just, don't look at me. I'm nobody," basically. And then she sneaks into the plantation, goes and talks to her people, and says, "All right, how many of you are here on the plantation? All right, 70. Okay, bet. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Be ready by the river at the full moon. We're gonna get the hell out of here." That kind of thing. So this idea of women throughout history, like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and so many others who used their wits, used strategy, used subterfuge, used just intellect to get out of difficult situations. And of course, there were some guys too, like Robert Smalls, the guy that freed
Mm-hmm.
an entire plantations, stole a boat, used the signals, had the
Mm-hmm.
disguise on. But I definitely feel like a lot of the ladies haven't had those stories told enough. Even Harriet Tubman herself, who, she did these things 150 years ago, and yet a lot of it hasn't even come out until the past few decades. And people are still incredulous, like, wait, she was a spy? She was paid by the government? Well, yes, she was. And so I'm trying to counteract some of those absences.
So what I find really interesting was that with the book takes place during a time when New Orleans is really sort of gearing up for the Civil War.
Right.
So can you explain to us why you chose that time frame?
Yeah. When I'm drafting something, it's very nebulous to me. I'm not sure who the cast of characters are going to be. I'm not certain about the settings I'm going to use or the time. But as I did research while writing the book, something became clear to me that I didn't quite understand until I wrote this book. And that's that New Orleans at the start of the 1800s was almost kind of stable. There was basically a third free Black folks, a third enslaved Black folks, and then a third, other white people and other people. And the free Black people were able to start companies, buy property, and amass wealth. And they did very well for themselves. I mean, Lenore, who's the sort of second or third main character in the book, she's based on a real historical figure who was somebody who had so much wealth. She actually decided to start a school for Black kids because there were no public schools in Louisiana for Black kids. Um, and so, in sort of figuring out the research, what I noticed is that between about 1830 up to the Civil War, the temperature in the city is rising. Really, the entire state, and of course, the entire South. You have laws being passed that, for example, say, well, sure, it was okay to teach the enslaved people how to read, but that's not going to be good anymore. You can't do it anymore. Or you could free yourself by earning some money and paying off the slave owner. Well, they get rid of some of those laws too. You see laws being passed across the South saying that, well, if you get free, you got to leave the state. You can't come back. You have to leave your family and go somewhere else. This happens in Virginia, for example, other places. And so I saw these things happening bit by bit that were designed to make life miserable for anybody who was Black. And so when I, understood that, I said, well, it made perfect sense to sort of set it between, say, 1844 and 1862, because dramatically things are just changing right in front of the character's eyes, and they're noticing it and commenting on it throughout the novel.
And what you really did, I think, was so genius was that you really have us following Audie's experience with the sort of, I don't like to call it antebellum because I feel like that word is so romantic when it
Yes.
really doesn't, you know what I'm saying? Like it really doesn't give the full weight of what was happening. So during the chattel slavery South, it
Yes.
really gives you a sense of her experience in the chattel slavery New Orleans South. But how did you, because what so much of the book is following her on these sort of journeys throughout the city. But New Orleans is an old city, but there's new development and all that. And so how did you sort of figure out how to take us on a journey with her throughout the city so that we see the chattel slavery New Orleans South?
You got all the good questions tonight, Jamila. Thank you. I don't think anybody's asked me that. And honestly, I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, but now that you say it, absolutely. Sometimes you don't know what you wrote to after you publish it. And so the idea that a big part of I mean, for real, right?
Uh-huh.
The fact that a big part of the narrative is Audie is this very young person sort of walking around town and seeing these sights, having these experiences. It's a bit of a sort of coming of age start to the book. And I think the reason why I did that subconsciously is because I knew that a lot of the readers would not know a lot of this background. They would be kind of confused. Like, wait a minute, I thought slavery always took place on plantations, also known as slave labor camps, right? Or,
Mhm.
how is it that she's able to move about, the city limits like that? It doesn't make any sense to me. But those things are exactly what New Orleans was. And so by making her a newcomer to the town, by making her very, very young, little naive at first, perhaps, and then having her sort of learn as the story goes on, I'm kind of teaching the reader subconsciously to understand this different arrangement that New Orleans had versus most American cities and even rural areas.
And you know what I think what you do with the timing of the book, particularly when you have Audie working with these women who are spies, because spoiler alert, Audie works with women who are spies. But what I think is so interesting is that time, because that's the time when Louisiana and New Orleans, they're sort of they're sort of getting ready for war, right? I mean, they're raising all these battalions and there's all this rhetoric, not just about, sort of suppressing and disenfranchising and harming Black people and free people of color, but it's also rise up, we have to defend the South. And so can you talk a little bit about your decision to have these spies sort of working against this rising up of New Orleans, the rising of all these battalions?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that throughout history, there's always an insurgency. You can name any war, World War II, especially in Europe during that time, World War One, the Civil War, the Revolutionary War. There's always people who are going to fight for what they think is right. And I think that these ladies are no different from that ethos. And so to me, it was very interesting. I had done some research and I had found documents that showed how ineffective the Confederates were in New Orleans.
Hmm.
And, I mean, in other places they fought pretty hard, Mississippi, Memphis,
Hmm.
Vicksburg, South Carolina, Virginia, on and on and on. But in New Orleans, they offered like no resistance. I mean, it was wild. The
Was
documents
it like
that
the first city to fall?
it was one of the very first ones. Absolutely. I mean, look, the war goes on to 1865. New Orleans is out
Hmm.
of it by like April of 62. So,
Right.
what is it? Grand opening, grand closing, right? Basically.
Right. That's exactly it.
Um, and the documents showed that like they were like burning their own uniforms to like hide from the Union that was showing up, that they were breaking their own guns so that they wouldn't be caught with weapons. You know, these guys were like paying these young men to be soldiers. They just like disbanded and ran off, just disappeared into the wilderness. They sunk their own ship. And I asked myself for about 20 years, because I found the research 20 years ago. I said, why would that happen? And it became very clear to me that of course, there's the external attack that's coming from the Union. But before that happens, you have these women who are the internal resistance, who are behind the scenes, behind the lines, doing whatever they can do possibly to undermine these dudes. And so, the example that I love is that, the Confederates say, okay, the Union's going to come in some boats and they're going to come down the Mississippi River and they're going to try and get to the city. Let's put some iron chains in front of over the river. It's going to stop the boats. And they're trying to order like 10 iron chains, which is, kind of a wacky plan, 100-foot long iron chains or whatever. But they want to get 10 chains. But for some reason, this is a true story. They only got one chain. And I'm like, okay, that's just like a comedy of errors. And I thought about it and thought about how a lot of these guys would use somebody like Adi as their sort of gopher. It's like, hey, gal, take this document that has the 10 chain order in it, the invoice or whatever, bring it over to so-and-so so we can get these chains. And I could see her, taking some makeup or whatever, lipstick, and like dabbing out the zero. So it's just one chain. And they go get the one chain, they put it across the river. The Union comes through the chain, and it's over. I mean, the very next morning after the ship arrives, I think the Confederacy just gives up basically. So these things are all tied together. And, I think about the fact that even today, I think 90% of the people who are in prison for murder are men. But my theory on
Hmm.
that is it's because the men get caught and the ladies are not getting caught for like defending themselves and, doing what they can to, not put up with abuse and that kind of stuff. And then they just keep it moving.
Oh, so you think there's just a lot of female murderers just roaming the streets?
Well, there's murder and there's killing. Those are two different things. So, sometimes the as the kids say, sometimes the op deserves it. But I'm just gonna leave that there.
Yeah, let's leave that there. So I just want to go back to sort of this idea that it's the women who are really doing the subversive work.
Mhm.
And the reason I want to go back to this is because I really would love for you to treat us to a little reading, but I'm going to ask you to read at least the opening paragraph, if not more, because
Okay.
I think it gives a good sense of the voice and of who Audie is right from the beginning. Would you mind?
I am happy to do that. Let me get to the page. Let's see what we have here.
It's page one.
Page one. Wow, that's deep into the book. Right after the prologue and the map. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, we're going to talk about the prologue. We are.
All right, let's see. We have a little music here to get me loosened up. All right. I'll read maybe 2 pages or so.
Okay.
Of all the tiresome habits of men, what drove Adi, known herein as Antoinette Marianne Dumarche, to her wits' end was their impulse to expand the pettiest of their lives' moments to epic proportions. Such men exalted minor disagreements to the level of legend, delivering a coup de grace to the jaw of a Yankee some 3 times their size. Of course, none of these meager men had a good trade. They were all captains of industry, each of them, but the barons of Holland and New York would soon eclipse their fortunes. Such men never encountered a bird pecking for sustenance. No, the creature was always a wolf at the door, its teeth eager to rip the tendons from a man's throat. Of course, this was the basement into which Adi's life had fallen. In the high-ceilinged dining room of her self-proclaimed father, John Dumarche's Vieux Carré townhouse, she imagined how recollections of the night might be transformed in the retelling, if any of them survived. It was early still, but the men were already several sheets to the wind. A spittoon lay rolling on its side. There was a scattering of empty brown bottles, and a filthy apron was draped on the kitchen doorknob. Hers, or Lenore's, or another's. Adi wasn't sure. In this pulsing night, the men were occupied, sharing drunken jokes about their exploits and their half-despised cronies. And so, of course, the bodies of the women present could become the only source of material for the massacre of March 1862. All the better to distract them. The banner, procured by Lenore, hung beneath the crown molding and proclaimed, "Quadroon Ball." Adi stood below, the cursed thing, wrestling in the mud of these men's desires. Adi's dark, thin shoulders shone glorious, like blackberries in moonlight. Above the peach fabric of her dress, Quadroon Ball evoked visions of grandeur, of wealthy, powerful, refined men engaging in light scandal, out of view of their pale, dismissive wives, back on their slave labor camps, also called plantations. This was no ballroom, though it might countenance a Chatish or a Viennese Walsh. She imagined that these facts wouldn't matter, that there would be a false version of her in the retelling. By this reliance on mythology and nostalgia, she imagined the men desired to burnish their self-regard. I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for treating us to that reading. And so can you tell everybody what I said about the first line when I read it and you came back with revisions?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for being, so helpful in reading the text, that draft of the book. And when you sent it back to me, you said, under no circumstances could I cut that first line, which I appreciate it. Thank you so much for telling me that. And I did not cut it, and nobody else cut it.
No, and I'm so glad because it's so nailed, sort of her pathos in that situation, in this moment, where she's saying, "This is just at the end of the day, we're doing this thing, we're doing this really big subversive thing, and at the end of the day, these are just some tiresome, loathsome men.
Yeah, they are the worst. They are the
They
worst.
are the worst."
Oh, I see some people have joined us. I just want to say hello to Billy. How you doing out there, Billy? And Raymond, I think I met you in DC recently. What's up? How you doing today?
Yeah, Raymond. Hey, you always got to say hello to a Raymond.
Absolutely. All the Raymonds. Absolutely. All the Raymonds. Absolutely. And then Vanessa Hua. So Vanessa is my good friend, also an author, has written some amazing work. We taught together at Swanee. It's so good to have you in the house as well. And I think Randy perhaps is one of my Twitter buddies, but it could maybe not. But it's good to see everybody out there in the audience. Thank you for being here tonight.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. So yeah, and there was a question I just noticed in the chat, and it was something that I wanted to talk to you about too. So I'm going to jump in and ask the question. So you do this thing. Well, let me preface it with the research that you did. Can you tell us a little bit about your research process? But then also, I'm really curious why you sort of couched this inside of a sort of imperfect research project.
Yeah. You know, I've read so many books that have allowed me to challenge my idea of what a historical text is. Like, your book, Moonrise of New Jessup, is a perfect example of that. Your book, first of all, taught me about the 1,200 plus Black settlements, which I was not aware there were that many of them out there in the world. And then
Mm-hmm.
your approach to writing those characters, I enjoy because it prizes authenticity over sensationalism. These people feel like real
Mm-hmm.
people. And
Mm-hmm.
so
Thank
in
you.
writing this book, I kept thinking about how can I make these characters be like the ancestors I know that I had? Like if I were sitting in a room with them, having conversations with them, what would that be like? And actually, you gave me this too. Yeah, shout out in the chat. It is a peer and genius book, Moonrise. Absolutely.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Ebony.
Um, absolutely. I mean, one of my favorite reads ever. Um, so you gave me this. So you gave me so many great comments after you read the early manuscript. And one of the things, you may have forgotten this, one of the things you said, I'm going to kind of like paraphrase, but you say, this narrative as written feels a little vanilla. Doesn't quite seem like Maurice a little bit. And the version I gave at that time had
Mm-hmm.
none of the sort of meta stuff. There was no prologues, there was no epilogue, there were no inserts, there was no maps. And it was much more of a linear telling. Like it was just straightforward front to back.
Because you
And
were taking it all out. You had
yeah,
it in there.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then the next version you gave me, you took it all out. And let me just tell y'all. So reading, y'all I'm sure have read his work. I hope that you have read or will read American Daughters. But I would say that reading Maurice's work is like somebody pulling up to the front of your house in like a muscle car, like an old, like a 1970s Chevy Chevelle, and the tires are like smoking and squealing. And he just pulls up and he just like slams on the brake and throws open the passenger car and is like, get in, let's go. And you just get in because that's what you're supposed to do. You have no idea where you're supposed to go. You have no idea what you're supposed to do, but you know that you're in for a ride. And so when you had given me the second version, I was like, where'd all the Maurice go?
I traded out the Maurice car for like an Uber Black. It's like a very
No,
calm ride.
not even. It was like the Pee Wee Herman bicycle. I mean, I don't mean
That's a great bicycle. You see that movie? Y'all seen that movie? That's a nice bike.
it's a nice bike, but it's not a 1970 Chevy Chevelle.
Well, you helped me so much because I mean, honestly, like here amongst family, I'll say like I think I was probably having a little bit of a crisis of confidence. I think I was like, well, maybe I shouldn't put this stuff in there. It's not going to really fit the narrative anymore. And when you came back, I doubled down. So I think the version you saw, I had the inserts, and I think maybe the epilogue, but there was no prologue and there was no
Mm-mm.
map yet. And so I'm like, you know what?
Mm-hmm.
Jamila's right. I got to stand in my truth. A Maurice book is going to have like a lot of these different sort of effects to it. And so to answer your question directly, this idea of having it be told from sort of like a compromised future a little bit, where you can question,
Mm-hmm.
what the story really is, what actually happened, who these people are. I think that's what history is really like. I think that whenever we know a story about anybody, take George Washington, for example, you know, there's the person that actually existed. Then there's the stories that we tell about them. Then it's how that story changes over time. So we have George Washington chopping the cherry tree, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I could see somebody, it hasn't happened yet. I mean, I just assume it would happen. Like just some person being like, you wrote this thing about these Black ladies who were spies and they didn't really do this. They weren't really spies, yada, yada, yada. But the way that I see it is that um, when we tell these stories, the stories are designed to help us understand the sort of essence of a person. So Washington, he did not chop down a cherry tree, but it's us trying to tell ourselves as Americans, we had a cool founder who was honest and noble and good-hearted. And so for me to have this story of these women who are, fighting against these incredible odds and trying to have their stories told, and yet they're being suppressed at every level throughout time, that's a very real thing that I see my sisters dealing with constantly. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm trying to encourage the reader to first of all go, yeah, this is the vibe of these women. as they have existed and as Black women exist today. And we don't know all the truth, but we know that they worked for the betterment of our society. They were the actual American daughters. They were trying to fight against injustice, and they were trying to get us all towards liberation. And that's why that text is built like that.
So you said it, so you don't have to ask you. You said they
Well,
were the actual American daughters.
and
So can you tell us why? Can you justify rather your use of that title?
I think this is a leading question, counselor. We're both lawyers here. I feel a leading question coming on.
No, that is the question. I led you to answer that question. Can you justify the use of your title?
Okay, I'll give you an example. This happened today. My friend told me about this. So I don't really hang on X or Twitter, or they call it, that much anymore. But they're always like just debating over things that, kind of, is it really necessary to fight constantly on everything? Today they were fighting about Beyonce because the cover of her new album, I think, was put up, and she's like, in the cowgirl hat on the horse with the American flag, and some of the people were like, "Well, why she got an American flag?" And I think what Beyonce would probably say in response is, "Well, I'm an American. My family's American, and we built this country. There's no America without us." And we see this effort both in mainstream culture and so-called conservative culture to try and excise Blackness from the story. But of course, if you take Blackness out of the story, what happens is, there's no rap, there's no jazz, there's no blues, there's no gospel, there's
There's
no
no
certain kind of,
stoplights. There's no
there's,
GPS.
there's no peanut butter, there's no cotton. I mean, the whole enterprise just falls apart. And so
No.
having the title as the American Daughters is asserting that idea that, look, we may have had these, other American daughters who existed, the daughters, whatever they call themselves. But the real American daughters are the ones who understood the heart of like the Constitution and the American idea of this country that could bring us all together in one place at one time and build a better future for everybody. And that's why they're the American daughters, because they're Americans. Counselor.
I mean, you know how I stand on it. I guess since name the book American Daughters, you got to stick with it now. Maybe in
Well,
the reprint.
I mean, they probably don't know. Jamila was trying to get me to call it the Confederate Daughters.
Yes, yes, I was. And I
And
was trying to get you to do that because I thought, just like you're trying to reclaim the idea of being American, this is a confederacy of women who were created and part of a larger movement to undermine the rebel government. And so I thought that calling it the Confederate Daughters would be a confederacy of women. So you're still taking the word back.
you know
I
what?
stand on that.
You're winning me over, and I think one of the next books I write, I might call it the Confederates or the Confederate Daughters, and that way, whenever I go to like certain places, I'll get like boycotted by like half the state, and I'm down for it. I'm down for it.
Well, that's interesting because, like with the argument on Twitter X today with Beyonce, there are people who are saying they don't want her to be played on country music stations. There are people I'm sure who are saying they're not going to buy her album
Right,
because of the fact that she is draped or she's wearing the American flag or
right.
wearing the colors. So it's interesting, this idea of reclaiming a word, particularly because some of the people who are doing that work are enslaved people,
That's right.
right?
That's
So,
right.
I mean, I think that that's something that, in your work you do so well is, and I get it. It's the American Daughters. I get it. Tell your publisher, I concede to the
Ah.
extent that but I just think that it's really interesting that the people who had no rights as Americans were some of the very people who are fighting so hard for those rights, particularly in your book. Now, can you tell us a little bit? I know that there's some talk about genre. And I think particularly in the publishing industry, we all get sort of put into these silos of genre. But your book sort of bends multiple genres. It sort of steps into historical fiction, spends a little time there. We also end up in a couple of other places. Can you talk to us a little bit about your decision to sort of play around in different genres?
Oh yeah. I mean, look, I think that all of us authors, whether it's you or Toni Morrison, whoever, we have the things we like to do in our work. And for me, this idea of genre bending, this idea of sort of standing betwixt and between different genres is really important to me. You know, my first book, my first book, baby, We Cast a Shadow, is a book that when it came out, I'll never forget. Like the first like couple of months of reviews, every single review had a different genre for it. Somebody called it a dystopian novel. Somebody called it a satire. Different review called it like a sci-fi fantasy book. Somebody else called it a horror book. And I was just like laughing, like, haha, you can't peg it down. But the reason why is because it has all those elements to it. And so when I'm doing a historical book, you know, there are some writers who just write historical fiction in a sort of straightest sense. It's just, you know, all the facts are picked from reality in the past. Everything is going to sort of play straightforward. Where again, history is always more complicated than we give credit for it. So, you know, with this book, the feeling is that this is a book that has a coming of age aspect to it. Like it has also the historical narrative. It has this sort of speculative narrative to it. And also it's just this book that in my mind is sort of playing or holding hands with so many other books by our literary ancestors. So whether it's a Toni Morrison, a Richard Wright, a Ralph Ellison, Charles Chestnut, I'm trying to pull in little bits and pieces from everybody along the way because we're all holding hands. And I've learned now that I'm kind of, you know, in my third book that whether I want to or not, it's going to be there. So I mentioned We Cast a Shadow. I had never read Black No More by George Schuyler, which is a book about a Black man who becomes white, which is the basic plot of what happens in We Cast. Now, why'd I do it? Because again, we're joined to the ancestors. We can't help it. And so that makes my work more complex, more nuanced, more multivalenced than otherwise it would be.
Do you think that you took inspiration from like Saidiya Hartman saying that we should sort of fill in the gaps and speculate about history as well?
Oh, 100%. 100%. I mean, look, they've been doing it forever. I mean, if you look at the way that, you know, there's this recent joke about how men think about Rome, you know, over and over again throughout the day, 5 times a day, 10 times a day, that kind of thing. And reading these stories about like Caesar or reading these stories about, you know, King Louis, the 14th, there's so much embellishment and speculation. I just saw this movie that came out back in November. Nobody else saw it, called Napoleon by Ridley Scott, which, you know, has all these weird moments where he's like, you know, he's in this weird relationship with this woman and they don't know any of that stuff. They're just kind of filling in the blanks. But the way I see it is that, you know, Miss Hartman was exactly right. The idea of having some facts and then understanding you have to sort of build a bridge from the facts towards the truth in the absence of certain information, we always do that. We always have done that. And for me in this book in particular, because these women and women like them, whether they were enslaved or not, were often like forgotten by history. Their stories were not told contemporaneously. If the stories were told, the stories were suppressed. If the stories were suppressed but sort of existed, they were sort of warped by people. I mean, look, there are people with PhDs who went to Harvard, taught at Yale, you know, work at Stanford, who if I were to ask them certain questions about African-American ladies from the past, they would have no idea because it's not a part of the educational system. It's this sort of otherized idea of history. And so to me, that means I have carte blanche to try and make these stories as full as possible. And again, one more quick example, that's kind of what a movie like Schindler's List is like, Spielberg's Schindler's List. That's a movie that's based on a lot of fact. But the reason why it's so powerful is because Spielberg uses his storytelling genius to bring things together in a sort of unique way. And that's why it's the most remembered Holocaust film of all time. That's why it won so many Academy Awards, because he brought it together in a way that made it make narrative sense and spiritual sense to people that were going to encounter the story.
Spiritual sense. Can you say a little bit more about that? Like, when you say, like, when you're bringing the story together, you know, I guess when you think of writing characters like Audie and Lenore and Sanite, how did they come together in sort of the spiritual sense for you?
Yeah,
Do
look, the
they,
spirit.
do they talk to you? Like, how do they come together for you in sort of spiritual sense?
No, thank you for that question. For me, storytelling is almost always a listening. You know, I won't quite call it a seance, but it's like I'm sitting there and I can imagine that these people are my ancestors, my relatives, or, you know, time is a flat circle. So they're still here with me in the room right now and I'm talking about them. And it makes it easier for me to have, for example, there's a scene where I think it's Audie, Lenore, Alabama, Mrs. Gaines, and somebody else talking all in the conversation at one time. And their voices are all very specific and different because I can see and hear and feel who they actually are. You know, somebody is more well-read. Somebody is more of a sort of a working class person. Somebody is enslaved. Somebody is a businesswoman. And to me, that is a spiritual thing. I think that literature goes wrong when there's a flattening of the characters, when it's designed to be generic and it's designed to appeal to everybody. And look, a lot of those books
Is
sell
that
well.
possible? Is
What's
it
that?
possible to appeal to everybody?
I mean, look, some people try, and sometimes those books will sell 10 million copies, and more power to them. But I would submit that, the way that I understand history, it's the work that has the spirit that tends to last over time versus the things that are sort of aiming for popular appeal, because these ladies are singular. I've not seen them anywhere else in fiction, and that's why I wanted to write about them.
Well, I know they appreciate it. So can you tell us, okay, so go back, because you didn't answer my question about the research that you did, just about the time period in New Orleans and how you really brought the city to life at that time, because, some buildings are still there that were there 150, 200 years ago.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
a lot of New Orleans is under development. A lot of the buildings have been raised. So how did you bring to life that particular time period? How did you see it?
No, thank you. I'm very fortunate to be a New Orleans person because a lot of places tear down their old buildings. And because the New Orleans economy kind of petered out in the early 20th century, we didn't tear down the French Quarter, for example. And so when I walk around the French Quarter, I can literally see like a building that probably would be the place where Sanite and Adi would have been living during that time period. I could walk right up to the gate, the little carriage house, and look into the courtyard and see the enslaved people's quarters and kind of speculate on what it must have been like to live in this place amongst all this opulence. Then there's the work of my elders. I had mentors in high school who would tell stories about resistance in New Orleans throughout time. And, being a knucklehead, 14, 15 years old, I'm like, yeah, whatever you say, Pops, that kind of thing. Then thinking back on it 30 years later and going, wait a second, Duck really did say that 30 years ago that this thing happened, and seeing the sort of spirit of resilience and resistance over, the entire course of New Orleans history. So it wasn't a surprise to say, oh, Lenore is like a millionaire, in 1850, for example. And then on top of that, the specific research, going to the archives, finding the documentation in different libraries and museums and such, and making a specific choice to like have this be historical, but not be pedantic about it. Whereas some historical writers are so keen on like the facts, they miss the big picture. They see the trees, but not the forest. And I want this to have a very all-encompassing look at what life was like for these women at this time.
Did you feel like you had, so that's why you sort of bookended it the way that you did with the research process?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, my mind is that there are probably hundreds of documents related to these women in this sort of universe, if you will. And I could bring some of those documents in and even show how some documents were created by people that were on their side and some people who were against them, and how things had been adulterated or changed over time. And that's what history is really like in real life. We change history constantly.
Now, can you tell us about the process of writing the book?
Oh, I
What
mean,
was that like?
it was the greatest thing. It was the greatest thing because I mentioned to somebody how I was writing this in John Grisham's old mansion in North Mississippi, Oxford. And I was sent there as like a sort of writer in residence scholar type person. And I started writing a book for about 4.5 months, and it wasn't going well. And I just stopped writing it. I wasn't interested in the book anymore. And now I burned half my time. So what's going to happen now? I took a break. I prayed, and I was like, well, okay, let's go back to it. And when I came back to the book, December 21st, 2020, it was like, I had a jetpack on. I was just flying ahead, hearing these women explain their stories to me. And it was, frankly, the easiest thing I ever wrote. The first draft of this book took about 3.5 months. And I've never had any doubts. It was like, what happened next? And they just kept telling me what happened next over and over again. And next thing you know, I had 200 plus pages or whatever it was. And it felt good. It felt like this was really a story that I wanted to tell and that it wanted to be told. Yeah.
So I think we have like 11 minutes left. So I'm going to go to the chat because I think we have a couple of questions and I don't want to take up all the time. So I'm just going to go down. Andrea Knott. Hello, Andrea. She says, I'm wondering why the choice was made to always say slave labor camp, also known as a plantation. Was that language actually used during that time period, or was it just used to satisfy the present language usage?
Well, you know, we started out, and thank you, Andrea, for the question and for being here tonight. Um, we were talking earlier about the antebellum period, and that term automatically creates in the mind of most people, you know, Gone with the Wind, this sort of respectable, beautiful, opulent South where, you know, people live in mansions with the nice velvet curtains and that kind of stuff. And we could say, well, no, let's go back to the chattel era of
Hmm.
America. That's a whole different connotation. And so sometimes I think if you're writing something, whether it's historical, whether it's a polemic, whether it's satire, sometimes people get the wrong idea. Like Dave Chappelle said all those years ago, he quit this show because there were people who were laughing at him and not in a good way. Like they were actually pleased at the buffoonery, you know, that kind of thing. And so I don't want anybody to read The American Daughters and think, well, you know, they were enslaved, but it wasn't that bad. Or, you know, it was a problem that they were enslaved, but it wasn't that, you know, they were fine in the long run. It's like, well, no, these are actual slave labor camps. And throughout history, these conflicts have existed. And we have excoriated other countries, like, you know, China, for example, for having these kind of things. What about us? And now, if you try and teach this in Alabama, for example, under this new law they're trying to pass, they'll say you can't talk about that. You can't even go there with that. And so, my job as a fiction writer is to make sure that there's not a single person that kind of can move past that word plantation really fast. And I got the idea from Song of Solomon. Toni Morrison does something very similar in the text where she's repeating certain phrases over and over again to raise the awareness of the reader and go, wait, something's going on here. And hopefully, some reader will go, oh, yeah, they were enslaved and they couldn't leave and they were not paid and they were being beaten. Wow, that's not a good place. And I want to recontextualize the idea of the plantation so that nobody wants to have weddings there. Nobody wants to go hang out at a plantation. They want to look at it and
Yeah,
go, oh, this was terrible. Now I understand. Yeah,
yeah, because people for real be having weddings at a plantation. So,
absolutely. And dressed like slaves sometimes.
yeah, that's a whole other conversation. All right, so the next question is from Ebony Lumumba. Did you encounter any trepidation in voicing a Black woman to share such a personal and complex narrative in history? If so, how did you overcome that? Or do you feel you did overcome it? Are you still overcoming it?
Wonderful question. Thank you so much for that, Miss Lumumba. Um, you know, I think that for writers like myself, we have to give it to the people and see what they say about it. And so, you know, I have a Substack where I talk about the craft of writing and about the joy of writing and those kinds of things. And one of the early posts I did was like over a year ago about this idea of writing a text, like writing a book or a story, and then you read it in front of your ideal audience, whoever that is, you know. And for me, my ideal audience is us. You know, look, it's probably Black folks. It's probably in New Orleans, and it's probably like, and this happened in real life. This was my book release in New Orleans on the 27th, right there in like the, you know how in the State of the Union, off like the right side of the president, there's like a little area for like these people in the black robes, you know, the Supreme Court justice.
Hmm.
So at my reading, at my book release, I had like a little mother's section. It was my mother, right? It was like my mother's
Hmm.
best friend, a bunch of mothers just sitting right there. And I'm thinking about like reading from this book and having them either kind of go like, that's right, son, you did a good job. Thank you for that. You know, you capture like our essence, our voice, our stories, our ethos versus mm-mm-mm. That boy done messed up. I thought we taught him better than that. I can't believe he did this. We got to talk to him after this thing is over. That kind of thing, right? And so when I'm writing these characters, I'm doing everything I possibly can to make sure that I'm representing them to the best of my ability. And what I've heard on the road now for the past 3 weeks is I've been doing that in the book. And what it comes from for me personally is knowing my community, knowing the ladies in my life, listening, and getting myself out of the way and putting them forefront. And I use the same technique like in my I'm not trying to advertise, but it's right here. This is my short story collection. This is my second book. And this book has, you know, some lady lead characters. It has some queer characters who lead. You know, I'm not a lady, I'm not queer, but I've gotten a reception, people who are part of these communities saying, you got it right. And again, these are my cousins, these are my aunties, these are my high school friends, my coworkers. And so when you do it from that perspective, it's not hard at all. It's just you just give it your all and let it go. Yeah, thank you for that question so much. I really appreciated it, Ebony.
Okay. All right. So when you just mentioned Toni Morrison and Song of Solomon, you mentioned it a couple of times, a little bit earlier too. Um, who are some of the other writers who sort of inspired your work here or your work overall?
Sure. I mean, I already mentioned several of them that are a big part of this book. I mean, obviously Toni Morrison, who is somebody that I can never like. I can mimic a lot of writers' sort of ideas and structures. I can't mimic her because she's so complex and she's just the greatest, of all time. Of course, Richard Wright, there's Ellison. I've named them for example. There's Baldwin. You can't forget him. And there's like a lot of writers who influenced it in things in ways I didn't expect. So, like for example, it doesn't kind of make sense, but to get the voices, like to get the third person narrator voice right, I read a lot of Virginia Woolf, which surprised me. Because what I realized was if you go back to like the 1850s, a lot of Americans sounded kind of British because we were closer in time to that sort of change, right? And so I kind of had that in the back of my mind. Another weird example, this is not literary, but it's music literature. Dolly Parton, everybody loves Dolly Parton, right? She's like the person that nobody hates. In my mind, Alabama, the character, kind of sounds like Dolly Parton. I can't really explain it, but it's like, it's just a strange thing that's in my head, but it made her voice click for me. So I'm the kind of writer who always has like a lot of influences and Easter eggs, and I'm getting a lot of inspiration from different sources. I mean, countless. I think I also mentioned even Tarantino, the director. He's kind of controversial, but his movies are always revenge movies. It's always like, Kill Bill, a lady gets revenge, Django, a slave gets revenge, Inglourious Basterds, some Jewish people get revenge. Well, this book has a big revenge element. And sort of like knowing that structure of how it plays out helped a lot by watching those movies and going, yeah, I know I can use those ingredients in this book to make it play out with some sort of verve.
Okay. All right. Do we have any more questions for Maurice? Because if not, I do have one more.
Such great questions tonight. Thank y'all so much for it.
Okay. Last three books that have blown your mind.
Thank you. That's a
What
great
are the
question.
last? Yeah. What are the last three books that have blown your mind?
Well, I already said yours. So that's number one right there. I
Oh,
mean,
thank you.
look, if y'all if you're not read New Jessup, there's not a spoiler. In the first like maybe 20 or so pages, there's a scene where the main character gets off a bus. And there's one of the most amazing descriptions of a community I've seen in my entire life. I remember I read it in my kitchen, standing up, cooking, got distracted, almost burned the place down. Then I turned the fire off and reread that passage again because it was so amazing. So that's number one right there.
Don't burn your house down. I appreciate the endorsement, but please do not burn your house down.
It would
I
be
am not on
it'd
your
be
insurance.
it'd be
You
a
are not on
fine
my insurance.
it'd be a fine sacrifice, for the pleasure of reading that book. My good brother Robert Jones Jr., The Prophets, one of my other favorite books of the past few years. When I read that book again, like he was like holding a lantern. He's like, this is what you can do with a narrative that people say can't be done. And if you haven't read that, I mean, my goodness, that brother, he just, oh. And then I guess a bit of a left field choice. There's a book that I read called Trust Exercise by Susan Choi. And that book was really helpful to me because it's one of the most unusual books in terms of the structure. I won't spoil it, but it's like a three-part structure. And I just kept thinking, okay, I'm not sure how she's doing this, but I want to learn from this text. And it was helpful to me in reading that and getting some lessons on how to write. Yeah, great question.
All right. And I did not ask Nicole's question in a very artful way, so I'm just going to ask her question. She wants to know more about bringing us back to the present in the end.
um,
No
so
spoilers, but
right. I mean, for me, the ending was clear. When I figured out how to do it, I was thinking about one of the few books I've read 3 times, which is Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And that book is very intense. It's very in the moment. And you're going through the narrative, you're going through, and then all of a sudden you're like, 200 years in the future. And you're like, wait, what just happened? And to me, that was important because I want us to think about how we see the past. What does the past mean to us? What does it do? How does it influence our lives? And so to me, it was just a joy writing that entire last part of the book. And it came out the way I wanted it to. I didn't know it would, and I just felt good writing it. Thanks.
all right. Well, I'm taking the liberty of asking the very last question,
You got
which
it.
is, what is next?
What is next? I have no
Mm-hmm.
idea. No, I know what's up. I just sold to my same publisher, One World Random House. My editor is Nicole Counts. It's been announced publicly. My next book, working title, is called Garden of Redemption. And there are two things I'm doing here. One, like August Wilson, I want to sort of cover New Orleans over different decades. That's number one. And number two, at least for this next book and maybe the one after it, I'm still in this mindset of like, I want to get these women's stories out. And so Garden of Redemption is set in the 1940s mostly, although there are some scenes that are in the 19 teens up to the 1980s. And I'm kind of covering my grandmother's generation. And I'm trying to think about the sort of things that she did in her life and her cohort, where they were really like the mothers of the civil rights generation, but they're almost totally unsung. Like that they were doing things in protest to things like racism and patriarchy that just people don't talk about. And so the short version is the book starts out with a girl who she's a teenager, joins the military during World War II, winds up in Europe with her best friend. They have some adventures, things happen, come back to New Orleans, and then they sort of, in their own ways, become the sort of foundation of the mid 20th century movement to, create more freedom for our community.
All right. All right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Maurice, for this really enlightening conversation. If y'all have not picked up this book, there are some links in the chat for you to do so. Nobody asked, but draft cards hold so much of our history. That is true. That is true. Thank you for that, Nicole.
Thank you for that.
So y'all pick up this book. Maurice, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be in conversation tonight. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
And pick up New Jessup. Thank you so much, Jamila, for hosting tonight. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for being here and your wonderful questions. Don't be a stranger. Find me on social media, on my Substack.
And thank you both for gracing our virtual halls. And it's really great to have you back in our orbit, Maurice. And congratulations on another great book. And I'm glad you mentioned Nicole Counts, who's really one of the great editors of all time. And so big shout out to her. Jamila Minnicks, thank you so much for doing the honors. We are ever grateful. You're an excellent interlocutor. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I remind everyone, I've also posted links. Please do buy books. Better yet, if you're in the neighborhood, come on down, browse our stacks. We are one of the great browsing experiences of all time. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district, open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. We have both their books, and well, I got all three of Maurice's. And today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, keeping me dutifully employed and furthering the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, into the future. So long, everyone. Be well. We hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you all so much.
Good night.